Hey folks, welcome back to NC State Dendrology. So today we're kicking off the second half of the semester lectures, shifting our focus from morphology and plant parts and plant types and plant vocabulary to forest types of North America. And so this is going to be split into two modules. The first module will focus on forest types of the southeastern United States. And then the second and last module will be forest types of North America. So we're going to start with a little bit more specific focus on the southeastern United States, and then we will broaden our focus to look at forest types of North America. So today I want to talk about sort of the context for that and why this is important as part of our study to be dendrologists. And then I want you to think about and learn about what factors control species distributions, and then how we can use that to also predict community types. So looking at forest community types and how they vary, we'll look at environmental gradients, especially focusing on temperature and precipitation. We'll talk a little bit about classification. We're not going to get into this in a very technical way, but I want you to understand where what the roots of forest classification and what factors are considered important. And then we'll do a quick overview of the forests of the southeastern United States that we're going to learn in this module. So forests, I think, don't always look identical, right? And I think every one of us in this class has seen forests that look different from each other. So what makes these two forests recognizably different? So you might notice on the forest on the left has a lot of structure to it of the landscape and topography. So it looks like there's a lot of rocks that are covered with moss. And if you look at the trees, they're not very large. They seem to be sort of growing in and amongst those rocks. And then if you look at the other vegetation, you can see that the forest floor has a good coverage by moss and ferns. And then comparing that, how is that different from the forest on the right? Forest on the right has a lot more larger trees, and they seem to be more even aged, right? If you look at the sizes of the trunks, there's a lot more similarity there. And then if you're looking at the structure, you can see that most of these trees are the same age, and there's not a whole lot in the understory. So the forest floor has a lot of empty areas, a little bit of moss too. So maybe precipitation isn't a limiting factor. But you can see that there is some dead wood on the forest floor. So these two forests are, the one on the left is Mirkwood and Fangorn Forest. It's Fangorn Forest, and then the one on the right is Lothlorien. So these are two fictional forests from The Lord of the Rings, for anybody who's a fan like I am. But these photos were taken at different places. The one on the left is taken in England, where that part of the movie was filmed, and then the one on the right was filmed in New Zealand. So who cares? Why is it important to recognize these different forest types? Well, a lot of you are in majors where understanding forest types and how to identify them is important. So for our forestry majors, you may be working for an industrial partner that wants you to scout some forest land for purchase or management. And the first thing you're going to need to do is figure out what forest type that it has, right? What are the key species? What is the structure? How old do you think that forest is? If you're a fisheries, wildlife, and conservation biology major, you may be working on a particular species and need to understand its habitat. And so there's some species that have a very particular forest type that they use. And that's something that's probably easier to find on a map than the particular species that you're looking for. So there's certain habitat attributes that species favor, and that could have something to do with structure or species composition. And then those of you who are in natural resources could work for an environmental consulting firm where you're assessing the impacts of a project on a particular forest. And so you need to understand what is that forest type and how might it respond to that disturbance. So those of you who are in environmental science, natural resources, forestry, fisheries, wildlife, and conservation biology will need some knowledge of how to look at a forest, assess the type that it is and its species composition. So that's why we cover this in dendrology. So first, let's talk about species. And this is a species we only talk about peripherally in dendrology, but it's closely related to Acer floridanum, what I like to call southern shug. This is the true sugar maple, Acer saccharum. And as you can see by the leaf drawing on the bottom, that this is the leaf that is on the Canada flag. And the species has a pretty broad distribution. This map, I don't think includes its range up into Canada very much, but different environmental factors limit where this species can occur. So if you're going out west, if you look at the photo on the far left, you'll see that those people are standing in a prairie. No really trees to speak of, right? Chiefly because of lack of precipitation as you get into the prairie states. And so to the west, sugar maple is limited by precipitation. There's just not enough water for that species to thrive. If you go up to the north, right, where the deciduous forest transitions into evergreen, the growing season may be too short for deciduous trees. And so you lose sugar maple the farther north you go. If you go to the east in the Maritime provinces, you can see it extends all the way to the ocean, but not into the ocean. And then the south, there's a good chance that competitively, sugar maple just isn't as competitive with some of the species that are found farther to the south. So it may be competition for resources, or there may be a particular temperature that the species just doesn't care for. So you can take any species of tree, look at its geographic map, and try and determine why it's found where it is. In North Carolina, we have many species of pine. I've only listed a few of them here. And you can see if you look at the maps, the distribution maps, and these are by county, that these species have different, overlapping, but different distributions. So if you look at longleaf pine on the far left, this is a true southeastern coastal plain species, extends all the way through the coast and into the Gulf states as well, but always located proximate to the coast. And Pinus taeta, loblolly pine, has a fairly similar distribution, although not found as far south in Florida. And it's found a little bit west of longleaf in the Piedmont of North Carolina. So if you look at the foliage for these two species, remember longleaf foliage can be as long as your forearm, a very, very long needled species. In fact, in this drawing, the foliage is actually folded over. Okay, loblolly pine, remember the foliage is about as long as your hand. If you live in Raleigh for any length of time, you've probably experienced ice storms, right? These long needled evergreen species predictably don't do very well in ice storms. So the foliage breaks off, branches break off. So these two species are limited in their western distribution by ice storms, right? So they're really not found much farther past Wake County. Whereas the species on the right, Pinus echinata, shortleaf pine, and Virginia pine, both have short foliage that's flexible, right? So if they get coated in ice, they're flexible and the ice can just break off. You'll notice that Virginia pine is not competitive at the coast and not competitive farther south, right? It's primarily a northern distribution. And so the point of this is that you can have lots of species that are similar. There's not one solution that's perfect in every way. Otherwise, we would only have one species of tree in any given place, which would be really terribly sad. But this variability in conditions means that we have overlapping ranges of species and quite a bit of diversity. This map is looking at major habitats of North America, and you'll notice it's from the North American Bird Conservation Initiative. This map shows that all the forests in the southeastern United States, in fact, most of the eastern United States, are temperate forests. Are they wrong? Of course they're not wrong, right? We are living in a temperate region and all our forests could be considered temperate. However, I don't think anybody in this class would go down to coastal forests, comparing them to mountain forests and saying that they're the same. But maybe for the purposes of this map, this broad distribution is fine, right? So we can predict forest type on climate, temperature being a very important factor, but precipitation being nearly or just as important. The length of the growing season is also a really important factor. Geology and soils can dictate forest type. The disturbance or lack of disturbance to the forest can predict forest type. And that disturbance can be natural disturbance or it could be human disturbance. And then also variations in time and space, right? So forests change over time. And also distributions of trees can be limited by geography. We'll talk about that more in just a moment. So looking at precipitation as just honing in on that because it's easy to find a precipitation map for the United States. you'll see that there is a broad, wide variation in precipitation across the United States. So we're in, this wet temperate area. Raleigh is about 45 inches of rainfall annually, right? Which is a nice amount of rainfall. And then you see it's a little bit more on the coastal plain and a little bit more in the mountains with some very, very wet areas in the far western part of the state. And then as you go to the Midwest, you'll see these lighter colors are showing that the annual precipitation in inches is much, much less, right? Getting to the point where you just have prairies and grasslands. The Rocky Mountains similarly are very water limited, right? So this limits forest development to certain areas, and it also restricts human development. So how much rainfall do you actually need to have a forest? So to have trees grow, right, and have a closed canopy forest, what I mean by that is the canopies of the forest, of the trees, adjacent trees are touching each other, right? There's not open areas with sky or open areas with ground visible. And you can see my friend Alan Weekly in the photo in the dark on the far left. In Joyce Kilmer Memorial Forest, this is a particularly dense forest, and you can see that the canopies, he's walking underneath the canopy with some of our students, and this is a closed forest type. Interestingly, you only need 18 inches of annual rainfall to have a closed forest type. 15 to 18 inches of rainfall, right? A very subtle difference. You can't really have a closed canopy forest. Instead, you have something like the south rim of the Grand Canyon shown in the picture on the center, right? So this is an open forest, or some people would call it a woodland. You can see there are bare patches of ground in between the trees, and the trees are not super tall with pointy canopies, right? They're more scrubby and closer to the ground. So this is what you would call a woodland, right? The canopies are not touching, and it's open, right? It's a much more open kind of structure. And then finally, with less than 15 inches of annual rainfall, trees really don't thrive. And so if you go to areas like the Sonoran Desert in central and southern Arizona, you can see there are these amazingly interesting landscapes in the Sonoran Desert that don't have trees unless you're near a river or other waterway. Instead, you have species that are specialized to retain water. So for example, the saguaro cactus. My family and I lived in Phoenix, Arizona for about a year and a half, and the annual rainfall in Phoenix is 7 inches, and sometimes they don't get all 7 inches. So it's a pretty amazing place to spend some time. So precipitation is really important, but it's not the only thing. And so I have this photo up here on the left from a backpacking trip my son and I did last fall. This is taken on Little Hump Mountain and Hump Mountain on the North Carolina-Tennessee border on the Appalachian Trail. And you can see there's no forest up here. So maybe I would think, well, there must not be enough precipitation. Actually, that's not the case at all. It's a different reason altogether. And so the point of this slide is just that forest ecology is pretty complex. There's a lot of different factors that explain variation, and you'll never have just one factor that explains it all, right? This is also what makes forest ecology a really fascinating field, right? Trying to understand that complexity. So like I said, we can look at forest classification at different scales. So this is important, right? Because depending on what you're interested in finding out, you might have a very broad forest type, or you might define it more narrowly. This map that's shown here is one taken from Emma Lucy Braun's work. She published a book called Eastern Trees in 1950 and mapped out the forest types, which actually is pretty good, and pretty good even today, even though there have been some fundamental changes to our forests. You can see North Carolina is split into 3 types, right? With the southeastern evergreen forest on the coastal plain, the Piedmont having oak pine, and then the mountains having oak chestnut. Well, as we learned about chestnut, that's really not a canopy or important tree species in the mountains anymore. And so we had to shift, because of that and other factors, we've had to shift our classifications of forests. So this is a little bit more of a modern map, which maps forest types slightly differently, right? Still looking at southern mixed forests, which kind of recognizes that the coastal plain is not all evergreen. And then looking at oak hickory forests and Appalachian oak forests going as you go west. So important to look at these different factors and how they change over time. Now, scale is really important. So if I am somebody doing remote sensing and I want to understand carbon sequestration, it might be perfectly legit to classify all of the southeastern as, southeastern evergreen forest. Maybe that classification type is appropriate for that application. But if I'm a park ranger at Great Smoky Mountains National Park, I need to understand forest types a little bit narrower classification, right? So this map is the overstory vegetation for Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And so if I'm designing a management plan, or maybe, for example, I'm trying to assess the fire risk for different parts of the park, knowing those different forest types is really, really important. And so it's hard to see the key for this one, but the dark green areas of the park are showing the spruce fir forest at the highest elevations. Actually, it's the yellow, just those little yellow dots are the highest parts of the park. And then there's other factors that are pulled in here as well. For example, when was the forest last logged? Is the forest a second growth forest, or is it truly old growth? Because those two forest types might be managed differently. You might want to protect your old growth forest a little bit more and limit or restrict access. So, if you're a ranger for Great Smoky Mountains National Park, you need to know a little bit more detail about the forest types that are there. So calling the whole thing an oak hickory forest is not very useful in that context. So if I am a ranger and I want to look at, on a very fine scale, I can look at different forest types within the same park. So here we're on the same trail at Joyce Kilmer Memorial Forest, and you can see that there are two different types of forest that we could recognize if we know what to look for. So the photo on the left shows a mesic to submesic forest. So mesic meaning middle, right? Sort of middle of the road. So medium amounts of rainfall, medium amounts of soil nutrients, right? Where the subxeric to xeric forest is shown on the right. Subxeric, xeric meaning dry. And so it might be important to recognize differences in this forest. So for example, you can see the forest on the left, and this is two forest types that would be grouped similarly, but they have different sets of species, right? So they are pretty subtly different. You can see some species overlap between both, right? So several of our oaks overlap between the two forest types. For example, northern red oak and chestnut oak, you can see here on both slides, right? We're found in both forests. Chestnut is in both forests, right? This long, narrow leaves with teeth. Red maple, which grows everywhere, and shagbark hickory. But then there's some species that really favor these mesic conditions, right? They need higher moisture, more nutrients, right? And so that gets your magnolias, tulip poplars, sugar maple, right? They love those rich forests. On the right side, you have a lot more oaks, right? Do you see blackjack oak, Quercus falcata, and Quercus velutina? Also pine, right, is on the xeric to subxeric part of that same trail. So what I'm saying here is, even on a very fine scale, if you go hike a 2-mile trail, you can see and acknowledge differences in the forest type. So in summary, environmental factors like temperature and precipitation, as well as time and scale, determine what type of forest you're going to find in a particular location. And depending on the application, you might choose a very broad forest type, or you might want to recognize subtle differences. Lots of factors play into species and forest distribution, so it's a complicated kind of science. And now we're going to move on to talk about how we study forest types in dendrology. So what are we going to do in this class? So this is a list of the major forest types in North America that we will teach. And you can see that in this map, you can see this fairly well represented on the map that I've got, right? Looking at southeastern evergreen forests, all the way up into the forests in Canada, right? Showing as boreal forests, and then grading into tundra. And then we'll look at temperate forests grading into woodlands in the north. So lots of different things, and this is subject to change, but these are the kind of the broad groupings of forest types that we'll learn in dendrology. So for North Carolina and the Southeast, where most of us live and will live, we're going to look at more detail and a greater number of forest types in North Carolina. And I've linked the North Carolina Natural Heritage Program because they recognize way more community types than we do. For example, we will talk about longleaf pine forest as one type. And if you take Forestry 261, we'll talk about a few types. But the North Carolina Natural Heritage System recognizes 16 different types if you know what to look for. So it's a balance. Forest types of North America, we're going to group into broader categories, right? And that's important because you may not live in North Carolina. You may not work in North Carolina. And so if you're going to be a dendrologist, you really need to understand forest types around the United States. Taking a break to ask a quick trivia question. So what % of the United States do you think is forested? Okay, the answer to that is about 1/3 forested, about 36% of the United States is forested. I don't know if that's higher or lower than what you thought. Next, what % of North Carolina is forested land? So if we actually do classification types, what % of North Carolina is forested? And so the answer to that is North Carolina is about 2/3 forested. So 67% or so of our land type is forest. Then lastly, which state do you think has the highest percentage of forest land? So you may not have thought about Maine, but Maine has nearly 90% of the land in Maine is forested, right? There's a lot in the far north that really does not have much human population and it's all forest up there. Okay, so we're going to focus first in our lectures next week will be on forests in North Carolina. So if we're going to go switch gears and talk about those, we'll talk about first about physiognomic provinces. What do we mean by physiognomy? What is the general form or appearance of forests, right? And that can be dictated partly by geology, or I'm sorry, by geography, but also other factors. And we'll also look at precipitation patterns in the state of North Carolina and how that affects forest types. Then we'll focus on forest types of the southeastern coastal plain. We'll start on specific forest types next week. And so before we go any farther with that, I just want to say that, you know, what I'm asking you to learn are the main types of forests in the southeastern coastal plain. And so we'll talk for each of those, we'll talk about the species that live there, what is the general structure or appearance of that forest, what are some of the disturbances that are natural or human caused to that forest, what are the threats that are important, and some of the key species that live there. So that's sort of the information that we'll learn for all of these forest type lectures. So it's important to start with the physiognomic regions of North Carolina. And so we can recognize those as 4 or possibly 5 types, right? The 4 types would be the mountains, the Piedmont, the intercoastal plain, which is quite different from the outer coastal plain or tidewater area. You can see the sandhills are tucked in. They're part of the intercoastal plain and certainly the highest in elevation. And because of their sandy soil, they can often have unique forest types and forest communities. These are delimited. This area is delimited. The line between the Piedmont and the intercoastal plain is called the fall line. So the outer coastal plain, right, this blue area is the tidewater region. This is any area that's influenced by tide. That does not have to be an ocean tide. That can be a moon tide or a wind tide. So remember in the last couple of hurricanes, we've had examples of hurricanes that had wind tides that flooded pretty far inland communities like New Bern, right? That's still considered part of the tidewater area. And if you look at this map, New Bern is still in that blue. We have the intercoastal plain. And so there's a sand ridge that's an ancient dune that separates the intercoastal plain from the outer coastal plain. And this intercoastal plain includes the sandhills, which are the highest points in the coastal plain. And then that's separated from the Piedmont by the fall line. And so the fall line is the change in the fall of the land. If we translate the word Piedmont, Pied means foot and Mont or means hill or mountain. And then finally, we have the escarpment, which separates the Piedmont from the Southern Blue Ridge. So if we're looking at this in profile or cross section, you can see the structure of the fall line. So this again is what delineates the intercoastal plain from the Piedmont, right? You can see there's a steep topography, and interestingly, historically, a lot of towns were located on the fall line. So towns like Raleigh, Roanoke Rapids, Richmond, you know, and there's a lot of place names that indicate the fall line. So why do you think there are a lot of towns or development based on the fall line? Well, for one thing, you've got trade routes, right? So progressing upstream is feasible until you reach a waterfall or the fall line. And you can see that reflected in place names like Falls Lake and Falls of the Neuse, right? This is where there's a steep change in topography that separates the intercoastal plain from the Piedmont. A lot of mills were located at the fall line. So if you look at old maps of mills in state, you'll see a lot of them were located at places with rushing water. We can also look at the climate for the state of North Carolina. So first of all, I want you to look at the top map, which is the average date of the last spring freeze. And you can see kind of, you know, it gets later as you move towards the mountains, and then the more tropical area on the coast is a little bit more tropical with a longer growing season. And then we have the average date of the first frost. So here in North Carolina, in Raleigh, that date is usually, I thought October 15th, but it looks like it might be closer to the 30th of October. And so for an example, in the Tidewater outer coastal plain area, if I'm in Carteret County, right, I can expect that my last spring freeze is before March 20th. And then my first freeze for frost is after November 15th. So it's a very long growing season. That changes the species that can grow there. So if you pick any one of these locations, you can see and determine the growing season. You can also look at these in terms of precipitation. So I have this old precipitation map that's shown here on the top, right? With the Piedmont being a fairly dry area, a little bit more rain on the coastal plain, and then the mountains actually have quite a lot of variation in precipitation, ranging from, you know, Piedmont-like levels to probably the rainiest area in North America outside the Pacific Northwest. This is actually on the temperate rainforest scale. So here in Raleigh, we have about 45 inches of rain a year. Highlands, North Carolina has well over 80 inches of rain a year. So that's a big difference, and that affects vegetation. There's a rain shadow, right? Once the clouds move up from the southeast, the rain drops over the Highlands and Blue Ridge Escarpment. And then there's a rain shadow, right? A little dry area where Asheville is on the other side of that escarpment. You can also look, there's a geology map of North Carolina. So you can see there's a wide variation in soils and rock types and origins in the state, right? With the eastern half of the state being old dune systems, western half of the state being earlier and older bedrock. I can pull up this map to look at land cover of North Carolina, and it's really hard to read the key here, but it's kind of neat to zoom in to look at the different land use types. For example, you can see the red is urban areas, so that's something that's really notable about this map. And then you can see generally the vegetation type and land cover is different from the coast, the Piedmont, and the mountains. So how do we define natural communities? And in this case, in our case, we're talking about forest communities. There are natural communities that are not forests, so I just want you to be aware of that. Right, so if we are going to a particular location and we want to understand what that natural community is, we have to look at the species composition and how much of each species is present, right? So what species are there, right? This is a fundamental task in dendrology, is species identification, but also how many of them are, right? Is it a very diverse forest, or is it generally limited to one type? The structure or physiognomy of the vegetation. So for example, this photo of Patsy Pond on the right has a canopy. Would you call it a closed canopy? I would not. I would call this an open canopy. Those canopies are not touching each other. And then there's not much else. It looks like there's just one species in the overstory, little to no mid-story, and then a very developed understory. So that's a specific vegetation physiognomy, and that can tell you what forest type you have. The environmental factors we've already talked about, right? Climate, soils, and slope position and orientation. So that's more important in the mountains. And then finally, natural disturbance. So again, this area of Patsy Pond on the right relies on fire to maintain this open category or this open canopy. So you can have prescribed fires every 1 or 2 years, and that keeps the competition down. And so this canopy remains, but there's really nothing in the mid-story. And that kind of disturbance can be mapped to any of a number of different types of disturbance. So that can be, in this case, it's fire, but you can also have susceptibility to wind, ice, and other kinds of damage or disturbance. So I'm going to get towards the end with a tree trivia question, right? How old was the ball cypress that was discovered fairly recently in the Three Sisters Swamp in the Black River? So the choices I have are greater than 500 years old, greater than 1,000 years old, greater than 2,000 years old. So this is just a poll, so no credit for getting the answer right or wrong. So the answer is they found a tree in the Three Sisters Swamp that was 2,624 years old was the estimated age, which is pretty amazing. So on my bucket list is to go visit the Black River with a friend of mine, so then I can take classes to go see these amazing and ancient trees. But that's definitely the oldest tree in the southeastern United States. So I want to wrap up and just have you understand that forest types can be defined very broadly or very, very narrowly and more detailed, depending on what you need to know and what you're using that forest type or forest classification for. There are many, many factors that influence forest type and the species composition. That includes temperature, precipitation, geology and soils, geography, disturbance, time, and space. The amount of annual precipitation, just one factor, can predict whether a site is closed forest, open woodland, or unforested. Important to understand that the US is about 1/3 or 36% forested, while North Carolina is close to 2/3 or 67% forested. And then the North Carolina physiognomic provinces are the outer coastal plain, the intercoastal plain, which includes the Sandhills, the Piedmont, and the Southern Blue Ridge. And then finally, natural communities can be defined as having similar species composition and similar structure, and perhaps an environmental variables that dictate their presence or absence, and then perhaps some disturbance on how they are maintained over time. And so that is the end of our lecture. I hope you enjoyed learning about how we start thinking about and classifying forest types and communities, and we will dive right into forest community types next week. And that's a wrap.